Mr. Adrian Miller. How are you?
Doing all right. How are you feeling?
I am terrific. I'm so delighted that you joined me for this fun and rich conversation. Food is one of my favorite subjects. You know that?
Oh, cool.
It's one of my favorite things to talk about. And I think that it's one of my favorite things to talk about because in Black culture, and you've talked about this, we celebrate and memorialize, like everything involves food. And I have so many fond memories that, pertain to food and great meals and community and family.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, food, we all eat, right? So food
Yeah.
connects us in a way that other things don't. I can only think of a few things, maybe music, sports, faith. But yeah, food is one of those mainstays. And we have such a rich history in our community that I love that I've fallen into this work because I didn't start out thinking I would be a food writer. So, and I know we're going to talk about that journey.
Yeah, we are. And by the way, that's a mighty fine hat. I didn't tell Adrian to wear that. And we're just kindred spirits like that. If you see my little, we're kindred. Right, right, right. You did that. I like that. I like that.
Yeah.
So without further ado, I want to jump right in because you are such a wealth of knowledge and just have this incredible brain trust around this subject. I want to know, as do the good people listening, how do you define soul food? And if you would also describe what is your idea soul food meal?
Okay. Well, I tell people that soul food is just one aspect of African American cooking because unfortunately, soul food is often a catch-all for all the types of cooking that we do. But I think the food of the Louisiana, like the Creole food of
Yes.
New Orleans, I think the low country food of Charleston and Savannah, they're related, but I think there's something different there. So soul food is the cuisine of African Americans that brings together the culinary techniques, ingredients, and traditions of West Africa, Western Europe, and the Americas. And this all comes together in the American South. But the key aspect to me of soul food is it's really the food that African Americans took out of the South during the Great Migration and transplanted in other parts of the country. Because soul food and Southern food, though heavily related, they're really different. And if you talk to people in the South, they don't really say soul food that often. They actually call it home cooking or country cooking, So it's really this food that gets a name once it leaves its home.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. So you talked to
I forgot to say my ideal meal.
Yeah, share your ideal meal. Lay it
Okay.
on us. What's it got?
So for me, the ideal soul food meal would be whole fried catfish. I mean, bone in, whole fried catfish with some greens. I like mustard and turnip greens as a mix.
Okay.
Some black eyed peas and some coleslaw, because I like fish with my coleslaw.
Okay.
And then some sliced white bread. I know, but when I think of fried fish, that's what I think of. Some hot sauce and then a red drink.
Red drink.
Yeah, purple, preferably Kool-Aid, but I could do with some soda or something like that. Because in our culture, red is a color and a flavor. We don't call things cherry
is.
or strawberry or has hints of cranberry. It's just red.
It's
But
just
I've been
red.
noticing something. I have been noticing something. A lot of these youngins are starting to like purple and blue. And as I wrote in my book, I do believe the children are our future, that we should teach them well, let them lead the way, but not on Kool-Aid because they're messing it up.
It was always red in my house. It was red drink, and you would get a red cup, and you had to write your name on those cups too. But you're right; it was always red.
I'm curious, where did you grow up?
So I grew up in Oakland, California, but by way of the Great Migration, like you mentioned, my family is Southern. Everybody migrated from the South. In fact, my family traced our genealogy and discovered that some of the matriarchs of our family were actually enslaved women in Tennessee, right? And some of those women were domestics. They cooked, they were in the house, in the big house. They were talented cooks. And when the, Great Migration came about, my Lucy head hunter, the matriarch, wanted her daughters and everybody to get the hell on out of there because she didn't want them to be relegated into a life of domestic servitude. So folks migrated to Detroit. Now, this is on my father's side. Now, on my mother's side of the family, don't really know the origins. That's one of the things I want to do this year is find out more about my family on my mother's side. But what I do know is they come from a long line of really fabulous cooks. So I grew up watching grandma and mom and aunts cook. And when I was old enough, guess what I had to do? I had to get a little footstool or get a chair and help, clean and cut greens. And, that's where it all started. And I can fry up a mighty fine catfish. Let me just tell you that.
All
and
right.
some red beans and rice. And
that's what I'm talking about.
Yes. And I love that you said bread because people as educated and refined as, we are, and as some Black folks, sitting watching this, that, eat with a fork, eat their greens with a fork in company, but might sop it up with some cornbread in private because that's, what we saw our elders in the family do.
Yep.
And it doesn't mean I'm any less refined. Right?
Yep. So if I don't have if I don't have the white bread, then I will do a cornbread. But with fried fish, I usually have white bread with it. So
yes, I love a good piece of white bread with some fried fish, or even I know how people feel about the swine, even a good pork chop. I'm a sucker for a good pork chop sandwich, and all I need is a good pork chop and a piece of white bread, some okra, and I'm happy as a lark.
Nice.
Happy as a lark. Or as my pastor says, a pig in slop.
I love it.
That's a great meal. What's the dessert?
Oh, I'm a big fan of coconut cake. I love coconut cake. Yes. But I think my second one would be peach cobbler.
Okay. The peach cobbler.
Yeah.
Now, for me, I love that coconut cake, but I love that Southern caramel cake.
Oh, yeah.
I'm talking about the old school caramel that these youngins don't know nothing about.
Exactly. But the thing is, you just don't find that very often because I can't tell you how many times I've ordered caramel cake at a place and they just messed it up. It's not what it's supposed to be.
You got to really know what you're doing. And I think that you really have to, there's like a certain ingredient of love that goes into that cake that a lot of people don't have, because if you know how to make the frosting or the icing, you have to labor with it and stir unless you know the shortcut. If you want to know the shortcut, you need to inbox me. I'll share the shortcut with you.
All right.
Have a shortcut, and it's just as rich and yummy. But I love that caramel cake, and I also love a good piece of pecan pie. Even though I only have it once a year, when I prepare it for Thanksgiving, I don't really eat everybody's pecan pie because I don't want to be set up for a disappointment, so I have it once a year with Thanksgiving. I'm serious about it.
I totally get it. I get it.
I'm serious. So while I have you, I want to go on this journey through culinary history with you. I want to go back to the motherland and all of her culinary influence. And I'd love for you to share with me and the good people listening, how did those African origins, as well as the ancestors' Black American lived experience, influence what we know as food in America?
Yeah, so most people of African heritage in the United States, we trace our roots to the part of the country, pretty much from the coast, from Senegal in the north down to Angola in the south. Most people come from that part. So there are other parts of Africa that people come from, but most come from that part. And in West Africa, the tradition in terms of culinary is to have a savory soup, stew, or sauce served alongside or on top of some starch. So that starch could be rice. It could be some kind of cereal like sorghum or millet, a pulse like black eyed peas, and then tropical yams, which are not the same thing as yams in the United States. What we call yams here are dark flesh sweet potatoes, completely different plant. I just want people to know that. So that kind of framework for a meal comes across the Atlantic along with several ingredients. So okra, black eyed peas, watermelon, a type of rice. It was a reddish kind of rice, sesame seeds, all these other things come across the Atlantic with them because, these people didn't show up as blank slates, right? They were enslaved human beings that had traditions in terms of faith, the way they lived their lives, the way they cooked, the way they ate. And so the story of soul food is really trying to adapt to this new situation under horrific circumstances. So during the Middle Passage, in the early years, enslaved Africans were fed rotten European food. And the death rates got so high that slavers actually started feeding the enslaved the foods that they were used to from wherever they came from in West Africa. So if they knew that they had a bunch of Senegambians below deck in chains, they would feed them rice-based dishes, something like we call hop and john, which is a mix of black-eyed peas and rice, things like that, in order to improve the mortality rates. Because for them, it was just an economic game, right? For the slaveholders, they just wanted to keep enough of this human cargo alive that when they got to the Americas and disembarked, they could make enough money. Right. So they had to change their tactics. And then in the United States, slaveholders controlled the amount of food that enslaved people got. And this was a display of power. So typically enslaved people got 5 pounds of some starch, rice, cornmeal, mostly cornmeal, because that was plentiful, or sweet potatoes, a couple of pounds of smoked, salted, pickled, or dried meats, usually pork. But you saw there are instances of beef and fish. Again, it was what was ever cheapest, and a jug of molasses. So our enslaved ancestors had to figure out how to survive by gardening, hunting, fishing, foraging to supplement their diet. And so if you look at the typical day for an enslaved person, especially on a large plantation, which was really only 40% of slavery, most people who were enslaved were on small farms with 5 enslaved people or fewer, and then the slaveholding family. So in those small farm and city situations where there was more intimate contact with the slaveholder, pretty much everybody ate out of the same pot because it didn't make economic sense to have separate lines of cooking and feeding. But on the large plantations, they did that. So typically, people would be awakened right before dawn, and then they would be fed out of a trough, a mix of cornbread and buttermilk, all mixed up. They could not use utensils because those were potential weapons, and slaveholders were always afraid of a rebellion, right? Because they knew what they were doing was wrong. And so the enslaved people had to eat either with their hands and fingers, or they had to use seafood shells as something. So then they would go work until noon. Then they would come back. That same trough would have been cleaned out, and then the enslaved cooks would have made pretty much a bunch of vegetables, maybe a little meat to season the vegetables, but essentially seasonal vegetables. And again, eating with your hands. And then they would work until sunset. And then after dark, they would have supper. And supper was leftovers from that midday meal, usually. So if you think about that, they only got access to the things we think about, like fried chicken, barbecue, all these other things, access to white sugar, flour to make these things only on the weekends when the work schedule slowed or on special occasions. So day in and day out, what enslaved people were eating was very close to what we call vegan today, because meat was a prestige item and all these other things were prestigious, and Black people were not worthy to have regular access to them, right? Because that meant that they had a higher status than what white slaveholders wanted them to have.
Wow, lots to unpack. So these vegan meals, right, that were fed to the enslaved ancestors in these troughs, these meals, were they prepared by enslaved women, or were these, so enslaved women, were these, I grew up being told that the enslaved people were essentially fed scraps of things, right? I don't think I'd argue that feeding folks out of a trough and, sound like you slopping hogs or something, as they say in the South, is scraps. I would agree with that. However, is there truth to that? Like the enslaved women that were preparing meals for the slave owners, that they would share just whatever was left, those shoes and fuse. Did those get to the enslaved people? Is there truth to that?
So it's part of the story. A lot of this comes from two narratives. One is that for the enslaved people working in the big house, they got the leftovers of the meal that the slaveholder family had. So, but that, I don't know how true that is, because they were all eating out of the same pot. So it may seem like it was the leftovers, but I mean, they were all eating the same food for the most part. For the ones working in the fields, this narrative comes from something called the hog killing. So every year, the hundreds of hogs would be killed on the large plantation to process meat to get you through the winter. And the things that could not be processed were often the internal organs. And then there were also things that weren't valued, like the ham hock, the pig's feet, things like that. So enslaved people got those to eat. And so that's where a lot of this kind of leftover and scraps narrative comes from. But at the same time, enslaved people were gardening their own food, and often they were gardening African ingredients if they could, if the climate was suited that, because, we got tropical plants in a temperate climate, so it doesn't always work. But they were foraging, they were fishing, they were hunting, they were doing all these other things to supplement their diet. That was not scraps. That was their own resourcefulness to make sure that they survived. So that's why I say the scrap thing is just part of the story. I know that's one of the reasons why soul food gets heavily criticized, because even when I told people I was writing this book, years ago, I said, man, why are you writing about slave food? Why are you writing about the white people's garbage? That does not need to be celebrated. We've gotten past that point. And so a lot of the motivation for this book was to just sort out fact from fiction about what's really going on with our history. And there's two parts of it. There's a critical part, where you denigrate soul food because of that, but then also it gets celebrated for the same reasons, right? Because then it's the idea that our ingenuity, we took stuff that people didn't want and made it delicious. But if you go back, I'm going to blow you away with something. I actually was reading oral history of a formerly enslaved person reflecting back on their life, and they said that their slaveholder, because they didn't make chitlins well enough. So that tells you that white people were eating chitlins. And even to this day, there are white people who eat chitlins. They may not say it publicly, but there's a lot of white people that eat chitlins.
A lot of that shit, them chitlins, that swine.
Yep. So every year in Sally, South Carolina, in late August, there is a chitlin festival that was started, hosted, and run all by white people.
Wow. No, I know that, and there are white people and white allies that watch this. And I know that, I know plenty of white folks that love themselves some soul food, that love a good meal with all the fixings, as my grandma used to say. From the rooter to the tutor, high on the hog, low on the hog, right? I know that happens. And I've seen some recipes and some things on folks doing some stuff on YouTube that I ain't gonna get into, like gentrifying some of these culinary favorites, like putting stuff in the mac and cheese. The mac and cheese is fine the way it is. It don't need no, pumpkin spice or no, I've seen some pretty dastardly things, but I will agree that whites, hey, I mean, who doesn't love good food, right? Who doesn't love a good meal? I got a question for you. When you talk about the enslaved ancestors and how they were gardening and fishing and hunting and things of that nature, you took me back to something that I learned, years back, about how when the ancestors were taken into captivity and they were hiding rice grains, and things to bring to the new land, right? To Americas. You had women hiding rice grains in their cornrows and in their hair. They found a way to bring some of that culture and those, what do we want to call them? Those staples with them. What do you know of that? Or what can you tell us about that?
So I have heard those stories. I just don't know how true they are. And only for this reason. If you go back and look at reports of the time when people were getting taken from Africa in slavery, a lot of times they were kidnapped and they were captives from war and stuff. So to me, having seeds in your hair is an amount of pre-planning, right? Like, you're going to be gone and going somewhere. A lot of these places, people didn't know that. In fact, there were a number of Africans who thought that white people were taking them to eat them. They thought white people were cannibals. So, that's the only reason why I just don't know if that's true, because a lot of these folks were kidnapped. They didn't know what they were going into. But it's entirely possible that for other reasons, people would have seeds in their hair, and then maybe it was accidental. So I just don't know. It's a fantastic story if it's true. I just don't know.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. So would you say there is a relationship between soul food and chattel slavery?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me add one more thing.
Sure.
Even if they weren't taking the seeds in their hair, slaveholders were definitely provisioning slave ships with foods from Africa to feed them. So a lot of that stuff. So, so the stuff gets over here. And it may have been more purposeful than people think. Yeah, there's a tremendous relationship to chattel slavery, because that is the situation that brought a lot of Africans to the Americas. And that introduced Africans to a lot different foods than what they were eating in West Africa. And then West Africans had to modify their diet by taking substitutes from the things they were exposed to, the new foods they were exposed to, and then trying to make them in a way that they were used to in Africa. So let me just give you an example. Greens. West Africa, greens are a central part of the diet. They're used to something called bitter leaf. That's a tropical green that's not going to grow in a tropical or a temperate climate like the US. So what do? They substituted for the bitter greens of Europe. So that's how we started eating collards, kale, mustard, turnip, all these other things. Some of these foods had been introduced into West Africa during the colonial period, but it gets ramped up on a large scale. And that just wouldn't happen without chattel slavery. So the use of pork, because a lot of enslaved Africans were Muslim, so they would not have eaten pork, so they were forced to eat their taboo food. Yeah, all this stuff happens because of chattel slavery. But that lays a foundation, and then African Americans build upon that when they're free, and then also when they start to move to other places. So a lot of soul food incorporates foods from other cultures as African Americans get exposed to other people. Like, there's a whole thing called hood Chinese, right? That's a thing. You've got spaghetti, right? There's a whole lot of people that have fried fish with spaghetti.
Yeah.
And that's a thing. Now, I get a lot of heat online about that, because there's a whole bunch of people that is nonsense.
You talk to somebody from the Midwest.
Yeah.
And you try to talk about some fish and spaghetti. It is a real thing, and I don't want any smoke.
Yep.
I don't want any smoke. Who am I to I've never had it, but in the Black family, look, unless it's a special occasion or a special occasion says it all, you usually got one meat. You got one entree. I mean, now somebody graduates, somebody get married, it's a baby shower or a homegoing repast. You might have two meat. Well, you might have somebody at a repast, a good Sister Green or somebody bring a big old pan of spaghetti, and somebody else has some fried chicken, because, she might not have said she was making a big old thing of spaghetti, but if she knew that there was fried chicken there, she wasn't bringing that spaghetti. That's just not what we really do,
Exactly. Yeah.
Question for you, because you're dropping these gems, right? And there's this whole argument about, these superfoods, right? That folks are talking about, right? And this whole movement, you want to eat superfoods. When you talk about kale, and it's like Black people been eating superfoods, been doing it. So does soul food get kind of a bad rap, you think?
Oh, absolutely. So, aside all the heat I get for just writing about soul food and celebrating it, the other main criticism about soul food is that it needs a warning label, and that, if you eat a lot of it, it's going to kill you. So what I tell people is, well, think more deeply about that. All right. First of all, listen to what nutritionists are telling us to eat. more dark leafy greens, more sweet potatoes, okra, hibiscus. All of these things are the building blocks of soul food. The second thing to understand is much of what we call soul food today was the celebration food of the South. And I don't care what culture you're talking about, that culture's celebration foods are not stuff that are meant to be, it's not stuff that's meant to be eaten regularly.
All the time, right.
Yeah, because it's usually higher in fat, got more sugar, all these things. So if you put soul foods, some aspects of soul food, right? Because there's a whole rich tradition of making vegetables in very healthy ways. If you put that all in context, and it's just like, okay, enjoy the fried chicken, the glorious desserts, the barbecue, all that stuff, but just don't have it all the time.
I don't know
Just
anybody
moderate.
who's eating that every day. I really don't. I don't know anybody growing up how I grew up. We couldn't afford to eat like that every day. That was when the food stamps hit. You know, that we were able to get, and I'm not lying. I'm not trying to make fun of. That was the reality when the food stamps hit. You know, we had some fried chicken, and what did Mama used to make? You know, we'd have things like rice and gravy, which you talked about a moment ago, was starch with a sorghum or gravy or something to that effect. The holidays, we'd have banana pudding and, you know, but that did not happen often.
Right. So when you look at the health outcomes in the Black community, soul food often gets scapegoated, because I agree with you. I don't think a lot of people are eating soul food day in and day out. But what are they eating? They're eating the convenience food. They're eating the junk food. They're eating the fast food. And that often in our neighborhoods, those are the food choices that overwhelm us, right? That's the stuff that's more prevalent instead of fresh vegetables and all these other things. And so I think people are loading up on that. And then soul food gets blamed for it unfairly. Because look, if you go back in time and look at obesity rates and health rates, you see that, let's say before 1960, maybe a quarter to a third of African Americans were considered obese and had these health problems. But then you get to 1980, 1990s, you're talking about 60 to 70%. So what changed? Soul food didn't change, but the prevalence of cheap calories definitely changed. That's one of the miracles, quote unquote, of our food system, is that it's made all of this food widely available. Some would say food-ish stuff widely available. And so it just pains me when I see all of these articles, especially written by Black folks in Black platforms, saying that soul food's bad, it's killing us, why are you guys eating that? And I'm just asking for some more comprehensive and complexity in the analysis, because I just don't think that soul food really is the culprit for all of this stuff. And then secondly, let's say that it is, then it's just a matter of tweaking how we eat these foods, right? And understand the celebration stuff is just once in a while.
Oh, yeah. And, you know, I have over the years adopted some healthier eating habits than some of the matriarchs and patriarchs in the family. And I found ways to make very flavorful, kind of elevated soul food dishes. You know, I don't necessarily have to cook my greens with neck bones and ham hocks. You know, do I do it from time to time? I absolutely do. I love a good smoked neck bone and some greens. If I'm feeling fancy, or if it wasn't a whole lot of trouble, I'll mix them. I'll mix some collards, and hell, I'll mix some collards and cabbage on sometimes and kind of pan fry them. And that's some good eating there. You know, even my son and his buddy, my boys, you know, they'll bust down some collards and cabbage and cornbread like it's no tomorrow, because they're football players. So I stay giving them, and they're college bound, so I stay feeding them. You know, cornbread is a staple for them, you know, just trying to kind of keep them bulked up and everything, and some good proteins. But I've learned how to make, you know, more health conscious collards that would make you still want to slap your mama, you know, using turkey butts or turkey necks, and not necessarily all that comes in the pack, just a little for flavor. And I know how to make the butter beans and the lima beans, and now some of that stuff I can't get around because, you know, that dressing, and we didn't talk about dressing. Are you a dressing fan? You like a good dressing? Okay, because it sure wasn't in that soul food meal I asked. I just have to ask. I love a good dressing.
Yeah, well, you asked for my absolute favorite meal,
I
right?
did. I did. I
So
can't and look, and I can't tell you what your favorite. So you're right. You're right.
yeah,
You're right.
yeah.
You're right. Talk about this stuff all day. I want to pivot to your book. Okay. I'd love for you to talk about it. Black Smoke, African Americans and the History of the United States of Barbecue. I want you to share with me and the good people listening, what can we expect to learn from it? Feel free to, give us a few tidbits. By the way, I love the title and I thought that it was a real clapback on white supremacy, the white supremacy we see on display in the barbecue space. I took it as black smoke. You don't want none. But
Yeah,
that's just me. That's just me. That's just the
yeah,
rebel in me, you
yeah.
know.
No, no, no. You're hitting the vibe. You're definitely hitting the vibe. So the thing that this all started when, well, I was writing my soul food book, and when I was writing my soul food book, I definitely intended to have a chapter on barbecue because so many Black-run soul food joints have a barbecue option, and then so
Yes.
many Black-run barbecue joints have soul food side dishes and desserts. So there wasn't, to me, a natural synergy. But there was so much on barbecue. I said, no, 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 I got to write about this separately. So
Oh.
the catalyst was, yeah. The catalyst was I was watching the Food Network, and it was Paula Deen's Southern Barbecue. And I thought, well, let me just watch this show to see what the trends are and who gets celebrated. And at the end of that show, not one Black person was featured. Hour-long show on Barbecue in South, not one Black person was featured. So yeah, so I thought two things. I thought, well, man, how does this happen in the year? It was 2004 then. How does this happen in the year 2004? And then the second thing I thought it was, well, maybe I got it twisted. Maybe it was Paula Deen's Scandinavian Barbecue, sponsored by Alabama White Sauce. So I started looking at other TV shows and magazines, and it was a widespread problem.
Same
They're
thing.
doing the same. So I was just like, okay, I know that barbecue is a huge part of Black culture. How does it get to the point where only white dudes are being celebrated? So Black Smoke is a thump on the head to say, look, if you're going to talk about African American traditions barbecue traditions in the US, you have to include African Americans.
Absolutely.
So what you find out in that is you look at the early history of barbecue, you see, I argue that it's Native American in origin. Not everybody agrees with me. There are people that think it's African in origin, but I just don't find strong evidence for that. And I'm a cat that I follow the facts. Now, if
Right.
somebody comes along and they definitively prove from Africa, that's great. Because look, I wanted to prove that it was definitively from Africa because I wanted to say, Wakanda forever, barbecue is
Hey.
ours. But I just couldn't see that. So I show
Right.
how Native Americans developed this art form, and then enslaved Africans and later enslaved African Americans then become the inheritors of this barbecue art. And the reason why is because old school barbecue was very labor intensive. It was about digging a trench, chopping wood, filling that trench up with the wood, burning it, then killing several animals, processing them, butchering them, and then butterflying them like this, spreading out and
Right.
sticking holes in the side. Then somebody had to flip those animals regularly for even cooking. Somebody had to maintain a separate fire to, get rid of the cold spots in the trench. Then somebody had to come by with a bucket and swab it with vinegar and spices to keep the meat moist and flavored. And then somebody had to set up the tables, serve the food, and then provide the entertainment. And guess who did all of that stuff? Enslaved African Americans. So that by the time you get to the turn of the 19th century, enslaved African Americans are barbecue's go-to cooks. In fact, there are newspaper articles in white spaces saying, yeah, if you're going to have real barbecue, a Negro or colored person is the one making it. So this goes on. And then it's not until the end of the 19th century that you start seeing white dudes getting celebrated in barbecue. But even the white men who are celebrated rely on an all-Black workforce. But then in the 1990s, that all changes because with the growth of the Food Network and all these other food magazines and stuff, at the very time, and people were more interested in barbecue. 1990s saw a lot of interest in regional American cuisines at a time when all of these barbecue cooks could have been celebrated in their diverse representation. White dude after white dude after white dude gets the love. And it's really four kinds of white dude. The Bubba type, the working class, white dude. You've got the competition cook, You've
Yeah.
got the fine dining chefs who are in barbecue now in ways they never were before 30 years ago. And then you've got the hipster type, the interesting glasses, facial hair, tattoos, piercings, maybe skinny jeans, but you don't see that a lot in barbecue.
Yeah.
All of those cats are the one who get the love, to the point now that, and people who are new to barbecue, right, who didn't grow up in a place where they got their first taste of barbecue from Black people, which, by the way, was for most people in the country, that was what happened, because it was usually
Yeah.
Black people who were running these joints. They come to barbecue, they don't know any better. So they're just
Right. They
relying
don't
on the
know the
Food Network.
history.
Right.
Yeah.
They're relying on this media to tell them who to follow, where to go. And so I'm trying to stem that tide. And I think since I've written my book, we're starting to see a lot of good things happen. Like, for instance, I'm on the Barbecue Hall of Fame nominating committee.
Hey.
In the last 5 years since I've been on it, we've nominated a lot of Black people on there. And there were only a couple represented before I got on the board. And it's not just me. I'm with like-minded people as well on the board. So we're seeing more Black people get cooking opportunities for barbecue and other things and getting on shows. So there's a long way to go until we're representative, but at least we're starting to make progress.
Yes, I love that. And I agree wholeheartedly, because one of my favorite things to do when I just don't have anything to do, even if it's on a low volume or mute, is watch the cooking shows. And you're absolutely right. I mean, Bobby Flay, and I'm not discrediting Bobby Flay, but Bobby Flay is like, the gold standard, by design of what we see on TV. Paula Deen, I'm not going to really give her a whole lot of, because I still remember what Paula Deen was talking about when she didn't think anybody was listening. And Paula, we forgave you for that. So don't be trying to rub it in our faces talking about, listen, I'm gonna leave Paula alone. Paula, we forgave you, but we haven't forgotten. We haven't forgotten those end slips and those things. But I think we forgave you. So don't be all on TV acting like you just discovered barbecue like Columbus or somebody. I can't give you a pass on that. But no, you're absolutely right. And I mean, these shows, this is a real hallmark, an event. They're roving from southern city to southern city. We got this barbecue cook-off today. And, all you see out there is white folks. So I'm happy that you're doing this. I'm happy that just didn't sit well with your spirit. And you said, listen, I'm gonna write about this. I'm gonna write, because my first experience with barbecue was a place called Flint's, out in the Bay Area. Okay, Flint's Barbecue. And then I had an aunt that was dating. I ain't trying to put my aunt's business out there, but she was dating, this gentleman that had Max Barbecue out in Richmond, California. And, it was love at first bite. And where did these folks come from? They came from the deep South and migrated to the Bay Area, during the Great Migration. And, it was love at first bite. It was love at first bite.
Exactly.
So I don't know where all this colonialism around the barbecue started. And I'm just glad that you said, no, this don't sit well with my moral compass. Let me put some people on some game here. I appreciate you for that, brother, because I'm tired of it too.
Yep. It's just messed up. And it didn't have to happen that way.
Right.
So, and now, unfortunately, like, barbecue was working class food when we dominated it. You could make a living, but now, compared to the money that white barbecue dudes are making right now, I mean, in these barbecue contests, you can make $100,000 in a weekend.
It's a pretty penny. It's a pretty, the stakes are high.
Yep. And they're making $1 million off the TV shows, the merchandise that they get off those shows, appearances. It's just a ton of money now is being made.
I agree. Well, I appreciate so much this rich conversation, and I want to pivot to the part of the show that I call For the Culture, where we talk about all things Black. Now, normally we talk about hip hop and rap, because I am an unabashed fan of rap music. And I remember how much anti-Blackness was perpetrated on that art form. It seems it's more mainstream and accepted now. But I remember, right? And I'm not afraid to share. I mean, we have hip hop and rap on kitty litter commercials now, and we've arrived, right? But I still believe there's vestiges of anti-Blackness perpetrated on that art form. The same with our food. So I got a question, and we're gonna tie the question to our theme, being that our theme is Black soul food, Black cooking. I'd like to hear from you. And you talked about this a little bit when we started out, right? I'd like for you to expound on the intersection between Southern soul food, right, or Southern cooking, as you refer to it, that Southern or Creole cooking and low country Southern cooking, because you did indicate that they are different. And I believe in that, because as bad as I'm a pretty damn good cook, but some of what they do in the Gullah Geechee community, listen, I don't even pretend. I don't even pretend. I don't want no smoke. I don't want no parts. Those folks know what they're doing with some of those roux and some. Listen, I'm not there. I got to step my game up. Talk to us about it.
Yeah, so the low country cuisine of the Gullah and Geechee people, because of several things are in play. So those people were brought here, their ancestors were brought here primarily for rice cultivation, because there was a type of indigenous rice in the Senegambia. And so they were brought here because of their expertise in rice to make a fortune for all these white slaveholders in rice. But the way that rice is cultivated was different than cotton. And so they had it's called the task system. So basically, as long as you got your task done, you had free time until the next task. And also the isolation of that area, people point out that the strongest African survivals are in that part of this country, because they had less contact from white people and less control from white people than other places. So it shows up with the food. And then you see a rich seafood diet, right? Because a lot of our enslaved ancestors came from coastal regions, and seafood was a very important part of it. So just the use of peanuts, peanuts are not native to West Africa, they're from South America, but ground nuts were very popular in West Africa. And so peanuts, when they get introduced, it gets substituted. But you see peanuts, like there's a whole bunch of like peanut soup, the use of crabs, oysters, shrimp, and all those things, okra, very, very pronounced in that part. In the Creole region, again, we have people from Senegambia brought there to cultivate rice in New Orleans. Later, sugar becomes much more important, but it was rice early on. But you have a different colonial influence. You have French and Spanish influences there. So the food just turns out differently. So a lot of it, when you're looking at the ingredients of a cuisine, a lot of it is, where are the people coming from in Africa? A lot of times we were intentionally mixed up in order to prevent joining forces and rebellion. But in some cases, a lot of people were brought from one place because they knew how to do something that was that could be exploited by the slaveholders. And then it's, where are the white people from? Most of the white people in the deep South part, where it's soul food's from, are British people. So it's British, Britain, Ireland, Scotland, and Germany. But on these coastal areas, before the British took over, you had other colonial powers. So you have Spanish and French influence. So all of that stuff comes in. And then the third piece is, well, who were the indigenous people in that area? Because people learned how to use local ingredients and stuff from the indigenous people. So all of these, the formula is the same, right? West Africa, Europe, Americas, but the way it plays out is differently based on the people involved.
Interesting. So if you could put into context for somebody who may not really have had any culinary experiences with, the low country versus Creole, like what are some of the dishes?
So like a low country dish would be peanuts and rice. Sometimes they call that peanut dressing, peanut soup, she crab soup, which is a type of crab, and you would put the eggs in there. So it had a special flavor. Shrimp and grits, which they used to call breakfast shrimp. And then there was like okra and rice that was called pilau or purloo, depending on who you're talking to. So those are some of the things. And then in the Creole, gumbo, which is an okra-based soup, pralines, which was like a pecan sweet, that was peculiar to that area. And then you've got a number of dishes like court bouillon, which is a kind of a seafood type of dish. I'm trying to think things that were heavily Africanized, but gumbo is probably the most significant one. Yeah, crawfish etouffee, but you could see how somebody used to seafood in their diet could adapt these French dishes. Boudin, which is a type of sausage, it's like a blood sausage, usually a mixture of spices, ground meat, and rice. So yeah, a lot of different things happening.
My talents don't quite extend too far into that. I haven't mastered that roux yet for the gumbo. It's some things that I just let somebody else do. Gumbo, I'll let somebody else do.
Sometimes you just,
suit. I know what my strong suit, like my son told one of his friends yesterday, I think they were playing Madden. He said, it's levels to this. It's levels, it's levels to this. And I'm going to share something real fun before we move on to the next question. I'll never forget, I was a freshman at the Clark Atlanta University, and I'm a California girl, so although I grew up, again, in that Southern cooking tradition, it took me to go home with one of my good girlfriends. Okay, her family is from South Carolina. I mean, low country South Carolina. I can't remember what city we were in, somewhere around Charleston or something, right? And, I go home with her for one of the breaks from school, and we're staying at her grandmother's house, and her grandmother got up, and, I was catching hell because coming from California, I hadn't met folks with the Gullah Geechee accent, right? So, I was having a hard time understanding, some of what they were saying to one another, and that sort of thing. So I'm sitting in it. I'm a little itty bitty thing, 18 years old, sitting at the table, and all the women are sitting at the table. And grandmother didn't say anything. My friend's grandmother, she just went around the table and put some grits in everybody's bowl. And I remember thinking, that's cute. I am not about to eat this. I hated oatmeal growing up. I hated malto meal growing up because that was all we, were eating in the morning. And I knew damn well I wasn't about to eat no grits. This was before I was converted. Okay. So next thing I know, she gets this can of pink salmon, that she had cooked on the stove. No, I saw the can of pink salmon, and she had done her thing on the stove and went around and gave everybody a healthy portion of that on top of it. I said to myself, oh, I know I'm not about to eat this. And I sat there, and I don't remember how I politely got out of it, but guess what? They didn't offer me an alternative. It was like they say in the Black folk family, if you don't eat what's for dinner or what's for breakfast, I guess you're not eating. And I did not eat that day. And I think I learned a valuable lesson on that day, that when Southern women offer you food, it's a real rebuke and disrespect not to try to consume it, right?
Yep.
Now, keep in mind, I had never had an issue in my family, which again, we were Southern cooks, right? That low country cooking was a different experience for me. And at that moment, I was not here for it, but try me today. Give me some grits and some shrimp or some fish and grits today. Try me today. I'm leaving no morsels in the bowl. I'm just a fan all around. I love a good bowl of grits without any sugar, savory only. I love a good bowl of shrimp and grits. I love a good bowl of fish and grits. I love a good oxtail with grits. I've started putting cooked oxtails on top of my grits with that gravy. It's such a blessing.
Yep, all of that stuff, all the above is good stuff. Yes, one's got to go.
One's got to go. Which one's got to go? You got peach cobbler, sweet potato, my favorite pecan, and pumpkin pie. Which has
obviously
got to
the
go?
Pumpkin pie.
Okay, I agree with you, because most Black folks, we do the other ones, but we don't do the pumpkin pie. One's got to go. Adrian, Which one's got to go? I don't know if this is pumpkin. What we gonna call? We gonna assume that's sweet potato, huh?
Sweet potato.
Mac
I
and
get
cheese.
sweet potato pie has to go.
Sweet potato pie over the yams and collards and mac and cheese. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Buy sweet potato. Now I had to put this one in here because you got black smoke.
Yeah.
Who has the best barbecue? One's got, well, no, you can either pick which one has to go.
But I'm a rib guy.
Okay.
So pork spare ribs is my thing. And I got used to Kansas City ribs.
Okay, well, I heard that. Well, I just want to thank you for joining me on the Black Fundraisers podcast to explore Black cultural influence on food. I couldn't imagine having had this conversation with anybody but you, and I'm so grateful for it.
Well, thanks for the invitation to get to chop it up with you, and I just appreciate you.
Yeah, this was wonderful. So thank you, and good people listening. We're going to continue with the series. Stay tuned for what we've got next, because it's all Black everything all month long. So stay tuned. And until our next episode, stay tuned, stay down, and keep your head up.